My boyfriend mocked me. To his friends, "Who's going to pay my rent if I dump her?" I stayed silent. He had no idea the man beside me owned his apartment. My name is Madison Carter. I was 29 years old when a phone call shattered a relationship I thought would eventually become a marriage. The strange thing is that if you'd asked me the week before whether Ethan and I were doing well, I would have said yes without hesitation. We weren't perfect, but I genuinely believed we had something stable and worth building on. At least that's what I believed. Ethan Walker and I had been together for nearly a year and a half. When we first met, he had the kind of energy that made people want to root for him. He worked part-time at a coffee shop while trying to build a social media career. Every conversation about the future seemed to come with excitement. A sponsorship was around the corner. A collaboration was in the works. A bigger opportunity was coming soon. I liked that optimism, probably because I was nothing like him. I planned everything, tracked every expense, and usually thought 10 steps ahead before making any major decision. Ethan made life feel lighter, at least in the beginning. He was thoughtful in ways that mattered. He remembered the little things I mentioned in passing. He brought coffee to my office during stressful weeks. When my father had surgery, he sat beside me in the waiting room for hours without complaining. Looking back, those moments made it much easier to ignore the warning signs that came later. About 6 months into our relationship, he admitted he was struggling financially. His apartment was expensive. Rent kept going up. He was stressed, embarrassed, and worried about falling behind. I offered to help temporarily. That was all it was supposed to be. A few months. Enough time for him to get back on his feet. Then life happened. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. What started as temporary help slowly became routine. One bill turned into another, then another after that, until supporting him no longer felt temporary at all. By the time a year had passed, I was still covering most of his rent. If anyone had asked why, I would have had a dozen answers ready. At the time, all of it made sense to me. I believed relationships required teamwork, and I genuinely thought Ethan was doing everything he could to get back on his feet. Looking back, I think I was protecting my idea of who Ethan was more than the reality standing in front of me. The day everything changed started quietly. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was helping my uncle with yard work. My uncle owned several rental properties around town. Real estate had started as a side investment years ago and somehow turned into a second career. We'd spent most of the morning trimming hedges and hauling branches into a trailer. By lunchtime, we were sitting on his porch drinking lemonade and enjoying the rare feeling of having nothing urgent to do. That was when he casually mentioned one of his tenants. I still haven't decided whether I'm renewing that lease. I glanced over. "What property?" He gave me the address. The second he said it, my stomach tightened. I knew that address. Very well, because it was Ethan's apartment building. I actually laughed at first. The coincidence seemed ridiculous. "Wait, you're Ethan's landlord?" My uncle looked confused. "Your boyfriend Ethan?" "Yeah." He shook his head and chuckled. "Small world." I smiled back, but something about the discovery felt strange. Not bad, just strange. Before I could think about it any further, my phone rang. "Ethan," I answered immediately. "Hey, where are you?" he asked. "At my uncle's place." "When are you heading home?" There was music in the background. People talking. Someone laughing. I assumed he was hanging out with friends. "Later." "Can you send the rent money before then?" I glanced toward my uncle. Something about the way Ethan said it rubbed me the wrong way. Not enough to start an argument. Just enough to notice. "I'll send it later." "Can you do it now?" I opened my mouth to answer. Then everything changed. At first, I thought he'd accidentally pulled the phone away from his ear. His voice became muffled. Background noise got louder. I heard a woman laughing. Then another voice. Then someone else. It sounded like a small group sitting together. "Ethan," I said. "Hold on." More laughter. A few seconds later, I heard him speaking again. Except he wasn't speaking to me. Or maybe he thought he wasn't. "Seriously," he said. "I don't even know why I keep her around except to pay for this place." The words hit so hard that my brain refused to process them. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood. Maybe I missed part of the sentence. Maybe he was talking about somebody else. Then another burst of laughter came from the room, and Ethan kept going. "No, seriously, she's sweet and all, but this apartment isn't cheap. My friends keep telling me to dump her, but who's covering rent if I do?" More laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind people share when everyone already understands the joke. My chest tightened. Across the porch, my uncle slowly lowered his glass. He'd heard every word. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe for what felt like several seconds. Instead, memories started flashing through my head. The countless times Ethan needed help. The emergencies. The overdue bills. The promises that things would get better next month. The way financial conversations always seemed to end with me reaching for my card. At the time, I'd called it support. Partnership. Love. Suddenly, none of those words felt quite right anymore. The woman in the background laughed again. Ethan laughed with her. That's the part I remember most. Not the words, the laughter, the ease of it, the complete absence of guilt. Good to know, I said. My voice sounded oddly calm, almost detached. Everything on the other end of the call stopped. What? I said good to know. The pause that followed felt completely different from the laughter a few seconds earlier. Now there was panic, confusion, the realization that something had gone very wrong. Madison, wait. I ended the call. For a while, neither my uncle nor I said anything. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. The world kept moving exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier. Mine didn't. My uncle finally broke the silence. Did he really just say that? I nodded. Yeah. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. You've been paying his rent this whole time? Pretty much. For over a year? Close. His expression darkened. My uncle wasn't someone who got angry easily. But family was different. Family always had been. What are you thinking? He asked. I looked down at my phone. Messages were already appearing. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Ethan was moving fast. I ignored all of them. Then I looked back at my uncle. You said the lease is ending soon. He nodded. End of next month. And you haven't decided whether you're renewing it? No. I stared across the street for a moment. My mind felt strangely clear. Not calm. Not numb. Just clear. Like a puzzle I'd been staring at for months had suddenly snapped into place. My uncle watched me carefully. You know, I've been considering renovations on that building. I looked at him. He shrugged. Been putting them off. Neither of us said much after that. We didn't need to. The conversation wasn't really about the apartment anymore. It was about consequences, about reality, about what happens when somebody mistakes generosity for obligation. A few minutes later, my uncle went inside and came back carrying his laptop. I watched him sit down, open it, log into his property management account. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching somebody else's life unfold from a distance. Madison, he said quietly, you don't have to make any decisions today. I appreciated that, because everyone else would have expected an explosion, a screaming phone call, a confrontation, a dramatic breakup. Instead, I found myself thinking about all the moments I'd ignored because they didn't fit the story I wanted to believe. The signs had always been there. I'd just been explaining them away. My phone buzzed again. Another missed call from Ethan. Then another. Then another. I turned it face down. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing to solve one of his problems. And the strange part? It felt like a relief. My uncle glanced toward the phone. Still calling? I nodded. He knows. A humorless smile crossed my uncle's face. Oh, he definitely knows. That evening, as I drove home, Ethan's missed calls kept piling up. 10, 12, 15. By the time I pulled into my driveway, he'd left 6 voicemails. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I sat in the car for a minute with the engine off, staring at my house. A few hours earlier, I'd believed I was helping the man I loved build a future. Now I wasn't even sure who he was. What I didn't realize then was that the phone call itself wasn't going to be the hardest part. The hardest part would be discovering how many people already knew exactly what Ethan thought of me, and how far he was willing to go once the money stopped. By the time I walked through my front door that evening, I already knew Ethan would be there. He spent so much time at my house that half of his belongings seemed to live there permanently. Shoes by the entryway, a jacket hanging over one of my dining chairs, his favorite snacks taking up space in my pantry. A year earlier, all of that would have felt comforting. That night, it felt different. Ethan was stretched across my couch watching Netflix when I walked in. He looked up and smiled. There you are. The casualness of it almost threw me off. No guilt. No awkwardness. No sign that he'd spent the afternoon laughing about me with his friends. For a brief second, I wondered if he'd somehow convinced himself none of it mattered. Then he asked the first question. Did you send the rent money? And there it was. No, how was your day? No, can we talk? No attempt to explain what happened on the phone. Just rent. I set my keys down. Not yet. He muted the television. Babe, I asked hours ago. I know. So when are you sending it? I'll get to it. His eyebrows pulled together. When? When I feel like it. That finally got his full attention. He sat up. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. For a moment, he just stared at me. I could see him trying to figure out whether I was annoyed, joking, or starting an argument. The possibility that I already knew the truth hadn't occurred to him yet. Or maybe he hoped it hadn't. Eventually, he shook his head and turned back toward the television. I headed upstairs before the conversation could continue. The second I closed my bedroom door, the weight of the day hit me. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Not crying. Not angry. Just exhausted. My laptop sat on the nightstand. Almost without thinking, I opened it and logged into my bank account. At first, I was only looking for confirmation. Some small piece of evidence that maybe I was overreacting. Instead, I found the opposite. Transfer after transfer. Month after month. Rent payments. Utility payments. Emergency expenses. Random financial setbacks. I started adding numbers. Then stopped. Then started again because I genuinely thought I must have made a mistake. I hadn't. The total was high enough to make my stomach drop. Not because I couldn't afford it. Because I suddenly realized how casually I'd been doing it. One payment never felt like much. Neither did the next one, or the one after that. The damage only became obvious when all the receipts were sitting in front of me at once. I spent nearly an hour scrolling through statements, and the deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't just the money, it was the pattern. Every financial crisis somehow belonged to Ethan. Every solution somehow belonged to me. At some point, helping had quietly become expected. That realization bothered me more than the number itself. My phone buzzed. A text from my uncle. Notice goes out tomorrow morning. I stared at it for a few seconds, then typed back. Okay. Nothing else. There was nothing else to say. Downstairs, I could hear the television still playing. Ethan laughing at something on screen, completely unaware that the foundation beneath his life had already started cracking. The next few days were strange. On the surface, everything looked normal. Ethan went to work. I went to work. We ate dinner together. We watched television. We talked about random things. But something fundamental had shifted. I couldn't stop noticing details I'd ignored before. The way he never asked questions about my day. The way conversations drifted back toward his goals, his plans, his frustrations. The way future discussions somehow ended with me solving a problem. Once you see a pattern, it's hard to stop seeing it. 3 days later, Ethan called me during my lunch break. The moment I answered, I knew something had happened. His voice was tight. Madison. What? I got something in the mail. I leaned back in my chair. Okay. My lease isn't being renewed. The panic underneath his words was obvious. I said nothing. I have 30 days. Another pause. Still nothing from me. Finally, he asked, Did you hear me? Yeah. Madison, I have 30 days. I heard you. His frustration immediately surfaced. Why are you acting like this isn't a big deal? It is a big deal. Then say something. I looked out the office window. People were crossing the street below. A delivery truck was backing into an alley. Life looked remarkably normal for a day that felt anything but. What do you want me to say? He hesitated. The answer seemed obvious to both of us. He wanted reassurance. He wanted a solution. He wanted me to tell him everything would be fine. Instead, I asked a different question. How much money do you have saved? The line went quiet. Not long. Just long enough. That's not the point. It kind of is. His irritation grew immediately. Madison. How much? Another pause. Then, a few hundred. I closed my eyes. A few $100s. After more than a year of support. After endless promises that things were improving. After repeated assurances that he was making progress. A few $100s. The number wasn't surprising. What surprised me was how little it surprised me. The next week turned into a parade of conversations about money. At first, Ethan approached the subject gently, then urgently, then desperately. One evening, he showed up at my house carrying apartment listings. We sat at the kitchen table while he spread them out in front of me. This one is decent. I glanced down. The rent was higher than his current place. Can you afford it? His expression tightened. Not right now. Then why are you looking at it? Because it's available. I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us needed to say what he was actually thinking. Finally, he did. I need help. There was something almost familiar about hearing those words. I'd heard them so many times before. Different circumstances. Different bills. Same request. How much? Relief flashed across his face, like he'd finally found an opening. Maybe 4,000. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The sound surprised both of us. His face immediately darkened. It's not funny. No, I said. It really isn't. It's a loan. Ethan. What? You make less than $1,000 some months. My social media is growing. I stared at him. The frustrating part wasn't that he believed it. The frustrating part was that he'd been saying the exact same thing for over a year. The same timeline. The same promises. The same future. Always just a few months away. I shook my head. You keep saying that. Because it's true. You've been saying it since before last Christmas. His jaw clenched. For the first time since we'd started talking, he looked genuinely scared. Not scared of losing me. Scared of losing the safety net he'd built his life around. That distinction mattered more than he realized. Please, he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. The thing people don't tell you about betrayal is that it rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in layers. First comes the shock. Then the questions. Then the uncomfortable realization that dozens of moments you once viewed one way suddenly look completely different. I thought about the phone call, the laughter, the confidence in his voice. And I finally asked the question I'd been carrying around for days. Ethan, do you actually love me? His eyes widened. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Of course I do. I held his gaze. then asked the part that really mattered. Would you still be here if I wasn't paying for things? The change in his expression was immediate, subtle, but impossible to miss. It only lasted a second before he looked away and reached for his coffee, but that second told me more than any speech ever could. If Ethan had laughed and answered immediately, I probably would have believed him. If he'd looked me in the eye and said, "Yes, of course I would," maybe some part of me would have wanted to fight for us. Instead, he hesitated. And hesitation has a way of exposing things people are trying very hard not to say. Madison, that's not fair. I sat back in my chair. There was something strangely familiar about that response. Every difficult conversation we'd ever had seemed to follow the same pattern. I'd ask a direct question. Ethan would avoid it. Then somehow we'd end up discussing my reaction instead of his behavior. Why isn't it fair? He rubbed the back of his neck. Because you're acting like our entire relationship was fake. I didn't say that. You're treating me like some kind of user. I almost smiled. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. What would you call someone who tells his friends he's only keeping his girlfriend around because she pays his rent? His jaw tightened. We're back to that again. Because that's where this started. It was a stupid joke. No. I shook my head. It was an honest joke. The words landed harder than I expected. For a second, he didn't respond. Then he stood up. I knew this was a mistake. I watched him gather the apartment listings. The conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd come looking for help, for reassurance, for another solution. Instead, he was being forced to confront something he'd spent weeks avoiding. The truth. And neither of us liked what it looked like. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, I got my first glimpse of what Ethan was telling other people. His mother called me while I was at work. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wishes I hadn't. Madison. Her voice was already tense. No greeting. No small talk. Just my name. Hi, Carol. Ethan told me what's happening. I stared out my office window. I'm sure he did. That was apparently the wrong answer. Her tone sharpened immediately. He's devastated. The word hung in the air between us. Devastated. Not embarrassed. Not remorseful. Not ashamed. Devastated. As if the tragedy in this situation was what had happened to Ethan. I listened quietly while she explained her son's version of events. According to him, I'd promised to support him while he built his career. I'd encouraged him to focus on content creation. I'd reassured him countless times that I believed in him. Then, without warning, I'd abandoned him. Listening to her felt like hearing a story based loosely on reality, but stripped of every important detail. The phone call never appeared. The comments never appeared. The laughter never appeared. The entire reason any of this was happening had somehow vanished. When she finally paused, I asked one question. Did Ethan tell you he called me his meal ticket? Silence. A long one. When she spoke again, her confidence had slipped slightly. He said it was taken out of context. I laughed. Not loudly. Just enough, because somehow that explanation was worse. He said it. People say stupid things. Then why didn't he tell you exactly what he said? She didn't answer. We both knew why. Because the actual quote sounded terrible, no matter how you explained it. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us changed our minds. Neither of us expected to. The surprising part came later. Over the next week, I started hearing from people I barely knew. Friends of Ethan. Friends of friends. People who'd somehow become emotionally invested in a relationship they'd only ever seen from the outside. The story spreading through Ethan's social circle painted him as a struggling dreamer who'd been abandoned by a wealthy girlfriend the second things got difficult. I would have been impressed by the creativity if I hadn't been living through it. One afternoon, my manager knocked on my office door. The expression on his face immediately made my stomach sink. Got a minute? I nodded. He closed the door behind him and handed me a printed email. I recognized the sender before I finished reading the first paragraph. Carol. According to the email, I was manipulative, financially controlling, emotionally abusive. The accusations were so exaggerated they almost felt absurd. When I finished reading, I handed the paper back. My manager looked at me. You want to explain what's going on? So I did. Everything. The rent, the transfers, the phone call, the apartment, the fallout. By the time I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Honestly? I nodded. The email raised more questions about the sender than it did about you. That was probably the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. The situation would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so exhausting. Because every new accusation followed the same pattern. People talked endlessly about the consequences Ethan was facing. Very few wanted to discuss how he got there. A week later, one of Ethan's friends reached out privately. Rachel. We'd only met a handful of times during the relationship, but she'd always seemed reasonable. Her message was short. Can we talk? We ended up speaking on the phone that night. What she told me explained a lot. Apparently, Ethan's story kept changing. To some people, I'd become controlling. To others, I'd grown jealous of his future success. To a few, I'd simply stopped caring. The details shifted depending on who was listening. The only thing that never changed was the missing phone call. That part somehow never made it into the story. I don't think everyone believes him anymore, Rachel admitted. What changed? She laughed softly. Him. That surprised me. What do you mean? The more he talks, the worse it sounds. I understood exactly what she meant. Eventually, when somebody keeps rewriting the same story, people start noticing, especially when the edits are obvious. Before hanging up, Rachel said something that stayed with me. At first, everyone felt sorry for him. I waited. Now people are starting to ask why a 27-year-old man needed his girlfriend paying his rent for over a year. Rachel hesitated before continuing. Honestly, Madison, I don't think most people are questioning you anymore. What do you mean? They're starting to question him. That hit harder than I expected. For weeks, I'd felt like I was defending myself against an entire crowd. Hearing that people were finally seeing the full picture felt less like a victory and more like a release. I sat there quietly after the call ended, because that was the question at the center of everything. Not the apartment, not the lease, not the breakup. That question. And nobody had a good answer. The deadline on Ethan's apartment came and went. Then another week passed. According to my uncle, Ethan still hadn't moved. He'd looked at apartments, talked about apartments, complained about apartments. But actual progress? Almost none. When my uncle finally called to tell me formal eviction proceedings had started, I wasn't shocked. By then, I'd stopped expecting Ethan to solve problems until somebody forced him to. The real surprise came a few weeks later. 3 nights after the eviction was finalized, somebody knocked on my door. It was just after 9. I wasn't expecting company. The knocking came again. I walked toward the window and looked outside. My stomach immediately dropped. Ethan stood on my porch. A large duffel bag sat beside him. His shoulders were slumped. His clothes looked wrinkled. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely defeated. I stared through the glass for nearly a minute before opening the door. The second it swung open, he spoke. Can I stay here for a few days? No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of everything that had happened. Just a request. I looked at the bag, then at him, and suddenly the last few months made perfect sense. Even now after the eviction, after the arguments, after the public fallout, after losing the apartment, some part of Ethan still believed I'd save him. That belief hurt more than anything he'd said on the phone, because it meant he still didn't understand why we were here. No, the answer came out quietly. But it was firm. His face fell immediately. Madison, please. No. I don't have anywhere else to go. I believed he was scared. I believed he was overwhelmed. I even believed he regretted parts of what had happened. But regret wasn't enough. Not anymore. If you were sorry, I said gently, you would have apologized before things got this bad. He looked down. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then he picked up the duffel bag. Halfway down the walkway, he stopped. For the first time all night, he looked less angry than exhausted. Whatever mistakes he'd made, the confidence he'd carried for months was gone. Without turning around, he said, I really did love you. Then he kept walking. I watched until he disappeared beyond the streetlights. That was the last time I saw him. A month later, I heard he'd moved into a shared apartment with roommates. He was working more hours, budgeting, trying to rebuild. And honestly, that was probably the best outcome possible. Not because I wanted revenge. I never did. I just wanted him to learn how to stand on his own. As for me, life slowly became quieter. My savings account started growing again. My weekends stopped revolving around emergencies. I spent more time with family, more time with friends, more time focusing on my own future instead of carrying someone else's. Every now and then, I still think about that afternoon on my uncle's porch. The phone call, the laughter, the woman in the background who laughed harder than anyone else. I still don't know who she was. What I do know is that she laughed harder than anyone in the room, and somehow that was the sound I remembered most. What I do know is that hearing that conversation probably saved me years of heartache. For a long time, I missed the future I thought we were building together. Eventually, I understood that future had only existed in my imagination. The moment Ethan called me his meal ticket, he gave me something I couldn't ignore anymore, the truth. It wasn't the truth I wanted, but it was the truth I needed. For a long time, I kept trying to save a relationship that only existed in my head. Once I finally accepted who Ethan really was, instead of who I hoped he would become, walking away stopped feeling impossible. It felt necessary.